The judge lifted a basket of potatoes the size of a man's fist and could not speak. He turned one over in his palm, then another, as though he expected them to explain themselves. Behind him, the long table groaned under squash, so broad a grown man needed both arms to hold one, beans hanging in clusters, thick as grape bunches, and tomatoes so red and heavy they dented the cloth where they sat. Every entry on that table belonged to the same hand, and every person crowding close already knew whose hand it was, though the names were still sealed in their envelopes. They whispered it anyway. One name passed mouth to ear down the line, carried on the same lips that a year before had laughed until they ached. A year before, those same men had slowed their buggies on the road just to watch the show and shake their heads. A year before, the most powerful man in the township had stood at her fence and called it a chicken parade and offered to buy her out for less than the land was worth, certain she would crawl to his door by winter. Eleanor Wynne did not crawl. She stood at the edge of the judging table in her plain dress with dirt still under her nails, and she smiled and she waited. The spring rain had come hard that year. It beat the fence posts sideways and turned the yard to soup and made the one cow stand with her head low and her eyes half shut, like she had given up trying to understand the weather and decided just to endure it. Eleanor Wynne stood at the kitchen window watching it come down and listening to a voice that was not there anymore. Her grandmother's voice, a thing the old woman had said over coffee so many times. It had worn a groove in Eleanor's memory, like a wheel rut in a road.
Nothing's worthless, child. There's only folks who haven't learned to read it yet. Eleanor had nodded then the way children nod, politely, without understanding. Now, standing at that window with the rain streaking the glass and the farm falling apart around her one season at a time, the words felt less like comfort and more like a dare she did not yet know how to take. The Wynne place sat 2 miles east of the town of Grover in Shawnee County, Kansas, a narrow strip of ground that her late husband's family had worked too hard for too long. 3 generations of Wynnes had pulled their living from that soil, and the soil showed it the way a man's face shows a life of worry. Where corn had once stood shoulder high, where wheat had once come in so thick you could lose a dog in it. Now the dirt cracked pale and gray, packed down like a wagon road, dead in every way that mattered, except that it still held together enough to break your heart each spring when you walked out, hoping this year might be different. It was never different. Emmett had died 3 winters back. A fever that started in his chest and finished in his bones and took 9 days to do what it did. Eleanor had sat beside him the whole time, held his hand when he could feel it, held it after he could not. And when it was done, and the neighbors had come and gone, and the house was quiet in that terrible way a house gets quiet when it has lost a voice, it was built around. She had stood in the yard and looked at the fields and made a decision that everyone in the township considered foolish. She stayed.
She stayed because leaving felt like agreeing with the thing that had taken Emmett. Like saying, yes, fine, you win. The land wins, the winter wins. I will go and be small somewhere else. And Eleanor Wynne was not built for smallness. She was built like her grandmother. Stubborn as a fence post, quiet about it, but immovable. So she stayed, and she worked. And the work wore her down slowly in the polite way that hard work wears down women who do it alone on land that has stopped giving back. Her days ran on a thread so tight it hummed. Morning she milked the one cow, gathered eggs from a dozen hens, weeded beds that gave back less each season. The beans came up spindly and pale. The squash set fruit and then rotted on the vine before it sized. The potatoes she dug in fall were small and few, hardly worth the spade work. She sold butter and the odd dozen eggs at the mercantile in town, and she counted coins at her kitchen table by lamplight, watching the pile shrink, doing the arithmetic that never came out right, no matter how many times she ran it. She owed the mercantile $47, a sum that sat on her chest at night like a stone. Not because it was so large, but because it was growing. Every month the account crept up, and the garden crept down, and the distance between what she owed and what she could pay stretched wider. The mercantile owner, a careful man named Jessup, had let her account run because he was decent and because his wife told him to. But decency has a ledger too, and Jessup had mentioned, quietly, the way decent men mention things, that he would need the account settled by autumn. Autumn, 5 months away. 5 months to pull $47 out of ground that could barely grow a weed. Across the road and a quarter-mile east lived Vernon Garth, and Vernon Garth was a problem that had no season. He was there in spring and summer and fall and winter, the way a stone in your shoe is there every step you take. He owned the seed and feed store in Grover, carried paper on half the farms in the township, sat on the county agricultural society, and held opinions the way other men held property, broadly, firmly, and with no intention of giving any of it up. He was a wide man, wide shoulders, wide belly, wide smile that never quite reached his eyes, and he had told Eleanor plainly, more than once, in that voice men use when they believe they are being kind and are actually being cruel, that a woman alone could not make that ground pay. He had offered to buy her out twice. The first time, 6 months after Emmett died. Standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and his sympathy laid on so thick you could have spread it with a knife. The price he named was an insult. Less than half what the land was worth, even tired as it was. Eleanor said no. Vernon smiled the way you smile at a child who refuses to put on a coat in January. "You'll come around," the smile said. "The cold will teach you." The second time was that February. He drove out after church, stood at the fence, did not come in, named a price even lower than the first, and said he was doing her a kindness because the land was worth less now than it had been 6 months ago.
which was true, and which was also his way of telling her that the longer she waited, the less she would get. Eleanor said no again. Vernon tipped his hat, smiled that smile, and drove away like a man who had all the time in the world, because he did. That was the thing about Vernon Garth. He did not need to rush. The land was not going anywhere. Eleanor was not going anywhere. And the soil was getting worse every year. All he had to do was wait. Her one steady comfort was Silas Drummond. The old man lived down the creek in a cabin he had built himself 40 years ago and repaired so many times that not a single original board remained, which made it either a completely new cabin or the most stubbornly old one in the county, depending on how you thought about things. Silas was 74 years old and had farmed 60 of those years and lost most of his hearing doing it. Folks in town talked past him, seated him in the back at meetings, counted him simple because he asked them to repeat things and sometimes got the answer wrong because he had not heard the question. Eleanor knew better. Silas Drummond was not simple. He was quiet, which is a different thing entirely, though the world has trouble telling them apart. He could tell rain by the way the swallows flew, could name a weed by its first leaf, could look at a field and tell you what it needed the way a doctor looks at a patient and knows before the patient speaks. He brought Eleanor dewberries in June, fixed her fence when it leaned, and listened, really listened, when she spoke of her worries. He did not try to solve them. He did not tell her to sell. He sat on the porch step and listened and nodded, and sometimes said a thing so plain and true it stayed with her for days. That spring, her worry had a shape, a specific terrible shape with a number attached to it. $47. And behind that number, the larger shape of a farm that was dying under her feet. She needed the ground to give more, and it had nothing left to give. She walked the beds in the evening light, crumbling the dead gray dirt between her fingers, and felt the old fear rise. The land was tired, so was she. Something had to change, and she did not know what could. It was Silas who brought the answer, though at the time it sounded less like an answer and more like a joke God was playing on a woman who could not afford to laugh. He came up the lane one April morning, waving his hat like a man trying to flag down a train, and when Eleanor got close enough to hear him, which with Silas meant close enough to touch, he told her that the hatchery in town had a ruined order. A railroad delay, a buyer in Kansas City who backed out. Near 200 chicks hatched and hungry, and nobody to take them. The hatchery man would practically give them away rather than feed them another week. Eleanor stared at him. What would I do with 200 chickens? Silas grinned. The grin cracked his whole face open and showed the gap where his left canine had been since a mule kicked him in 1867. Feed them, and let them feed you back. He said it like it was the simplest thing in the world. Chickens scratch. They eat bugs. They eat weeds. And what comes out the other end? Well, that's the best dressing God ever made for tired ground, older than farming itself. Every beast that walks feeds the ground it walks on. We just forgot to let them do it. Eleanor laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. She was a widow with $47 of debt and a garden that could not grow a decent potato. And the solution being offered to her was to add 180 hungry mouths to a place that could not feed the mouths it already had. But that night she did not sleep. She lay in the dark and turned it over and over and over, the way you turn a stone in your hand when you know there is something written on the other side, but you are afraid to look. By morning, the laugh had turned into a question, and a question is a dangerous thing for a woman who has run out of safe answers. She rode into town the next day, telling herself she was only going to look. The hatchery sat behind the depot, a long, low building loud with peeping, a sound so constant and so high it pressed against the inside of your skull like a living headache. The hatchery man led her to the back, and she stopped in the doorway. There were not 200. There were 180 by his count, crowded into crates and boxes and anything flat with sides. A yellow sea of them, each one no bigger than a plum and twice as loud. They moved like water, like one thing made of many things, and the noise. Lord, the noise. Take the lot, the man said. Price is barely more than the crates are worth. I'll throw in what feed I've got. Otherwise, I'm out the cost of keeping them, and they'll be worth nothing to me by Sunday. Eleanor did the arithmetic in her head, and the arithmetic frightened her. Even cheap. 180 mouths would eat. She had 1 cow's worth of skim and a granary nearly bare. She had no proper coop, no fencing fit to hold them, no notion of how to keep that many birds alive past a hard rain, and if they died, she could hear it already. The talk. The widow Wynne, who couldn't make her ground pay, went and bought 200 chickens on a whim. Vernon Garth would dine on that story for a month. She stood in the doorway a long while. The man waited, used to letting a thing sell itself. She thought of her grandmother. Nothing's worthless. There's only folks who haven't learned to read it yet. She thought of the beds, gray and cracked, giving back less each year, and of the account at the mercantile that would come due whether she was ready or not. The truth was, she had tried doing things the sensible way for 3 years, and the sensible way was sinking her. Slowly, respectably, but sinking all the same. Maybe ruin came either way. Maybe the only choice left was which kind of ruin she would pick, and whether she would go down doing the same thing that had not worked, or something nobody had thought to try. How soon would I have to take them? The man grinned. I can have a wagon for you in the hour. She took them, the whole loud, peeping, impossible lot of them.
They rode home in crates lashed to the wagon bed, while Eleanor held the reins and wondered what on earth she had done. Silas met her at the gate. One look at the wagon set him laughing so hard he had to sit down on the mounting block and wipe his eyes with the back of his hand.
"You went and did it."
"I went and did it." Her voice shook, somewhere between terror and a thrill she had not felt in years. The two feelings so close together, she could not tell where one ended and the other began. They carried the crates into the lean-to off the barn, where it was warm and out of the wind. The chicks poured out across the straw, a flood of yellow. And for a moment, Eleanor just stood and watched them and let herself hope, which frightened her more than the money or the gamble. She had been bankrupt in hope for a long time. Silas came every day that first week, and Eleanor was glad of it. He showed her how to keep a low fire for warmth without scorching the straw, how to bruise the grain so the smallest ones could manage it, how to dip each beak in water so they learned to drink. He had a patience that the years had only deepened, and watching him cup a struggling chick in his weathered hands, she understood why the town's dismissal of him had always angered her. He read living things the way other men read print, and under his quiet instruction, she began, slowly, clumsily, to learn the same. But it was Eleanor who solved the problem that Silas had not thought to solve. And that mattered, because the solution was the thing that changed everything. 180 chickens left to roam would strip her dooryard bare in a week and foul every step she took. Penned in one place, they would turn that patch to mud and waste everything they produced on ground she was not trying to grow in. She sat at her kitchen table with a stub of pencil and the back of a feed sack and tried to think her way through it. And it was the gray, cracked garden beds that gave her the idea. They needed exactly what the birds made: the scratching, the bugs eaten, the droppings worked in. What if instead of bringing the leavings to the garden, she brought the birds to the beds? Not loose where they would scratch up her seed, but penned in a way she could move. A coop with no floor and no fixed place. A coop on wheels. She brought the notion to Silas, half expecting him to laugh again. Instead, he went quiet, the way he did when something caught him, when something fit a groove in his understanding that he had not known was there. And then he nodded, slowly. Move them across a bed. Let them work it. Roll them on to the next when the first one's done. He paused, searching for the word. That's clever, Eleanor. That's real clever. They built the first one out of scrap. The barn yielded old boards. A busted hay rake gave up its wheels. Silas's shed surrendered a coil of wire that had been waiting 40 years for a purpose. The thing they made was ugly as sin. A long, low box open at the bottom, screened on the sides. Peak roof to shed rain. A hinged door at one end. 2 wheels at the back and 2 handles at the front, so a person could lift like a wheelbarrow and roll it along.
She put 20 birds in it the first day, the largest of the now half-grown lot, and set it over the worst of her dead beds. Then she stood back and watched. The birds did not know they had a job. They knew only that the ground beneath them was new and full of interest. They fell to scratching at once, kicking the packed gray crust loose, snapping up the sod bugs and cutworms that had been quietly eating her garden for 3 seasons. They pecked the weed seedlings to nubs. They dusted themselves in the loosened dirt and made a tremendous fuss. And everywhere they walked, they left the droppings that Silas swore by.
By evening, the patch beneath the coop, which that morning had been hard pale crust, no different from a wagon road, was tilled to a soft, dark crumble, dotted and worked through with their leavings. Eleanor knelt and pushed her fingers into it. It gave. For the first time in 3 years, the ground gave. She held that soil in her hand and brought it to her face and smelled it. That deep, sweet, mineral smell of earth that means to grow something. She had nearly forgotten it. She had thought that smell was gone from her land forever, but it was here, in her hand, in the ground the birds had worked in a single day. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, but she knelt there a long time, and when she stood, her knees were stiff, and her back ached, and the sun was almost gone, and she was smiling. Not the polite smile she gave the women at church, not the careful smile she gave Vernon Garth. A real smile, the kind that comes up from somewhere below the ribs and does not ask permission. She rolled the coop forward 6 feet onto the next stretch of bed, and did it again the next day, and the next. 1 coop became 3. She built the second faster than the first, and the third faster than the second. Her hands learning the work the way hands do, finding the rhythm of it. She split the flock among them and ran them in a line down the long beds, leapfrogging one ahead of another, so that the garden was always being worked somewhere. And then on a Thursday afternoon, with the light going gold and the birds clucking softly in their coops and the smell of turned earth rising up around her, she found the notebook. She had gone into the back of the barn to look for wire. A coil she remembered seeing somewhere behind the old grain bins. She moved a bin, shifted a crate, and behind a loose board at the base of the wall, she found a tin box she had never seen before. Emmett's handwriting on the lid. Just his initials, E. Dau. Inside was a notebook, not a diary, a farm journal. Pages and pages in Emmett's cramped, careful hand, planting dates, rainfall, yields, the kind of records a serious farmer keeps. She had not known he kept them. Emmett had been a quiet man, quieter even than Silas, and he had kept this ledger the way some men keep a prayer, private, persistent, full of a hope that the numbers did not support. She brought it to the kitchen table and read it by lamplight, and the reading took her breath. Because there on page after page were the records of 3 years of failure, and beside the failures, in the margins, in sketches so rough they were almost a code, were drawings, a box with no bottom, wheels at the back, a peaked roof, handles at the front, chickens scratched in quick lines underneath. Emmett had thought of it. The mobile coop, the birds on the beds, the whole idea that she believed she had invented sitting at this same table with a pencil and a feed sack. Emmett had drawn it first. He had drawn it and never built it, and she did not know why. The journal did not say. It simply moved on to the next season's planting dates as though the idea had come and gone like weather. But the last pages of the journal were different. The handwriting was the same, but the tone had changed. Emmett had begun tracking something else. Seed germination rates. 3 years of them. Carefully noted, row by row. The seed he had bought from Vernon Garth's store. And the numbers told a story that made Eleanor sit very still. Year 1, 70% germination. Respectable. Year 2, 51%. A hard drop. Year 3, 34%. A disaster. 1 seed in 3 coming up. On the same ground, in the same beds, with the same care. And at the bottom of the last page, in letters pressed so hard the pencil had almost torn the paper, Emmett had written 5 words. Not the soil's fault. Eleanor read the words 3 times. Then she closed the journal and sat in the dark kitchen and listened to the clock tick and felt something shift inside her. The edge of something. The corner of a shape she could not yet see whole. But she knew it was there. The way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes, because the air changes first. Emmett had not failed because he was a poor farmer. The seed had failed, and the seed had come from Vernon Garth. She put the journal in the drawer beside her bed, and she did not speak of it to anyone. Not yet. Because a thing half understood is a dangerous thing to speak aloud, and she needed to understand it whole before she said a word. The days passed. The coops rolled forward. The beds darkened and softened and came alive, and Eleanor worked with a new energy that had a hard edge to it, a sharpness. Because now she was not just trying to save her farm. She was trying to finish something Emmett had started and could not finish. And the difference between those 2 things, between saving and finishing, is the difference between holding on and reaching forward. The first week of May. Vernon Garth drove out again. He came in the afternoon, reined up at the fence, and looked over the rolling coops with an expression she had not seen on his face before. The amusement was still there, the wide, easy confidence, but underneath it, something else, something quicker. the way a dog's ears go forward when it hears a sound it does not like.
Mrs. Wynne?
He said it the way he always said it, like her name was a thing he was being generous to remember.
Heard about your enterprise. Had to see it for myself.
Eleanor leaned on the handle of the nearest coop. 20 birds scratching away behind her, the smell of fresh turned earth rising around them both. Good afternoon, Mr. Garth.
I count 3 of those contraptions. You count right. And 180 birds. 176. Lost 4 to weather.
He looked down the beds. Slowly. The way a man looks at a hand of cards he did not expect to see.
It's a curiosity, I'll give you that. But curiosities don't pay debts, and chickens don't grow crops. He smiled. They grow noise and feathers and droppings. 180 mouths eating you out of house and home. 176. The smile thinned. I'll tell you the same as before. No shame in admitting you can't make it work out here. My offer stands.
And what is the offer this time lower than the last I expect?
On account of all this foolishness I've sunk my money into.
His eyes narrowed. He had meant to be the one doing the cutting. People did not cut back at Vernon Garth, not in this township.
I'm only thinking of your welfare.
That's kind, but I believe I'll keep on a while yet. She lifted the coop handles and rolled the whole thing forward 6 feet. The birds clucked and tumbled and resettled. She turned her back to Vernon and scattered their grain from the bucket at her hip and did not look around. After a long moment, she heard his horse shift, the creak of the buggy, and then the sound of him driving away, slower than he had come, as though hurry was a thing that happened to other people, and Vernon Garth simply arrived when he chose and left when he was ready. Silas had watched the whole exchange from the barn shadow. When Vernon was gone, the old man came out and stood beside Eleanor and looked down the long beds.
You didn't tell him.
Tell him what?
That it's working.
Eleanor looked at her beds, at the crumbled soil behind the coops where the birds had already done their work, at the faint green haze of weeds already trying to come back, which meant the ground was alive enough to grow something again, which meant everything.
Let him laugh. Let them all laugh. The ground will do the talking come fall.
She believed it. For the first time in 3 years, she believed something about this farm. 2 weeks later, Vernon came back, and this time he was not laughing. He came in the morning, early, before the dew was off, which was not Vernon's way. Vernon was a man who arrived at mid-morning after a big breakfast, a man who let the world get warmed up before he stepped into it. To come at dawn meant something had changed. Eleanor saw the buggy from the kitchen window and felt the cold before she heard the knock. She opened the door and Vernon stood on her porch with an envelope in his hand and an expression she had never seen. Not the wide smile, not the easy confidence. Something harder, something that looked almost like anger, except that it was too controlled for anger. It was purpose.
A man who had come to do a thing he had decided to do. "Morning, Mrs. Wynne. Forgive the early call. Business matter." He held out the envelope. She took it, opened it, and read the paper inside. A promissory note, in Emmett's handwriting, signed by Emmett, dated 14 months before his death. A loan from Vernon Garth's store for seed and supplies. But the amount was wrong. Eleanor remembered the loan. Emmett had mentioned it, $20 for spring seed, a sum they could manage. Except the harvest had been poor. And then Emmett had gotten sick. And then Emmett had died. And the $20 had slipped into the pile of things Eleanor could not think about in those first dark months. The note in her hand did not say $20. It said $87, more than her debt at the mercantile, more than the farm had earned in the last 2 years combined. And it carried Vernon Garth's name as creditor and a due date circled in red ink. November 1st. "I don't understand." Her voice was steady. She made it steady. "Emmett borrowed $20, not 87. Vernon's face did not change. "The note says what it says, Mrs. Wynne. That's Emmett's signature. You can see it plain." "The signature is Emmett's. The amount is not what we agreed." "What you agreed, or what you remember agreeing. Grief does things to memory. I don't say it unkindly. But the note is the note, and it's past due." She looked at the paper, at Emmett's careful signature, at the amount written in a hand that was not Emmett's. Vernon's hand. The creditor fills in the terms. The borrower signs. And a dead man cannot testify to what the terms were when he signed, if the note is not met by November 1st. Vernon said it quietly, almost gently, the way a man gentles a horse before he puts the bit in. "I'll have no choice but to bring it to the county clerk, and the clerk will do what the law requires." "Seize the land." He did not say it. He did not have to. The law said it for him. A debt unpaid, a note unchallenged. A widow with no witness and no proof that the number had been changed. The law would do exactly what Vernon Garth wanted, and it would do it wearing the mask of fairness. Vernon put his hat on, nodded once, turned, and walked to his buggy with the heavy, careful step of a man who has laid a stone on a thing and means for it to stay. Eleanor stood on the porch holding the note and watching him drive away. The morning light came up warm and gold across her beds. The birds were scratching. The sound of them working the soil carried across the yard. She went inside, sat at the kitchen table, spread the note flat beside Emmett's journal, and looked at them side by side. The journal, 3 years of seed that would not grow. Germination rates dropping, not the soil's fault. The note, a debt inflated, a signature real, an amount false. A dead man's name used to take a living woman's land. And she understood something then. Sitting in her kitchen with the sound of her birds outside
and the smell of coffee going cold. She understood that Emmett had not failed. Emmett had been failed, carefully, patiently, over years, the way you fell a tree, not with one swing, but with many, each one exactly placed, each one cutting deeper, until the tree does not know it is falling, until it is already down. Vernon Garth had sold her husband seed that would not grow, and when the crops failed, Vernon had lent him money against the land, and when Emmett died, Vernon had come to the widow with a price so low it was an insult, and when the widow refused, he had waited, and now he had come with a note no dead man could dispute and a number no living woman could pay. It was not misfortune. It was a machine, and Emmett had been caught in it, and now Eleanor was caught in it, and the machine had been running a long time. She sat with that understanding. Then she put the journal and the note in the drawer together. Side by side, the evidence and the weapon. And she went outside and rolled her coops forward 6 feet and scattered grain for her birds and checked their water and did the work that needed doing. Because the work did not wait for understanding. The work did not wait for justice. The work only waited for hands willing to do it. And her hands were willing. The evening came soft and cool. Silas walked up the lane in the last light. Late as always, his hat pushed back, his limp worse in the damp. Eleanor met him at the fence, and they stood together, looking out over the garden. The beds behind the coops were dark and turned and ready. The beds ahead were still gray and cracked, and the coops sat between them like a border between 2 countries. One dead, one coming alive, and the birds working the crossing. Silas. Emmett didn't fail this farm. The old man was quiet, the kind of quiet that means a person is listening with everything they have. And when he turned to look at her, his eyes were steady. No, he said. He did not. And that was all. He did not ask what she meant. He did not ask what she had found. He knew. He had known for a long time. The way old men know things they cannot prove and do not speak of, because the world does not listen to old men who cannot hear the world. Eleanor looked at her garden, at the dark soil and the gray soil and the birds between them. She had 5 months. 5 months to make this ground pay. 5 months to grow enough to clear the mercantile debt and meet Vernon's note and stand on her own land in November and look him in the face and say, paid in full. 5 months. 176 birds. And a dead man's unfinished work to carry across the line. She picked up the coop handles, rolled them forward, 6 feet, into the gray. The birds did what birds do. They scratched, and the ground, slowly, reluctantly, like a fist unclenching, began to give.
The beans came up in 4 days. 4.
Eleanor stood over the row in the early morning light and counted the seedlings twice because she was certain she had miscounted. She had planted them into the first beds the coops had finished. The beds that had been gray hardpan 6 weeks ago. And now every single seed had taken. Every one. Not a gap in the row. Not a pale stem among them. They stood thick and deep green, and so uniform they looked like they had been placed by hand, which in a way they had. Not her hand, the bird's feet. 176 pairs of scratching, clawed, ridiculous feet that had done what no spade and no plow and no amount of human stubbornness had managed. She planted squash behind the beans and potatoes behind the squash. Working her way down the garden in the wake of the moving flock, like a woman following a tide and planting what it left behind. The early beds were already racing ahead of anything she had grown in years. The vines reached and twined and grabbed the stakes she set for them and kept climbing as though they had somewhere to be. The squash set blossoms, then fruit. Small green knobs that swelled visibly week to week. And the potatoes. Lord. The potatoes. She dug into one hill in mid-June. Just checking. Just curious. She loosened the soil with her fingers. It gave easily, soft as cake, and she brought up a potato, then another, then a whole nest of them. 6, 8, 10 to a single hill, smooth and heavy and bigger than any she had grown in the best years before Emmett died. She sat back on her heels in the dirt and laughed, alone in her garden, holding potatoes in both hands like a child holding treasure she had been told did not exist. It was working, not might work, not seemed to be working. It was working, and the proof was warm and solid and dirt-covered in her palms. The flock thrived too, fat and glossy on bugs and weeds and kitchen scraps. The pullets had begun to lay in late May, and by June the eggs were coming faster than Eleanor could gather them. More eggs than she had ever collected from her old dozen hens. More than she could eat or sell. She traded them down the road, gave them to Silas, who did not need them but took them, because refusing a gift from Eleanor Wynne was not something anyone with sense attempted. And still she had eggs, baskets of them, brown and warm, and so fresh the shells were still damp. There were hard mornings. A storm one night tipped a coop, and she lost 3 birds to the weather, and spent a wet dawn chasing the rest through the dark, with a lantern in one hand, and her nightgown plastered to her legs, and her language deteriorating with every chicken she failed to catch. A weasel got into the run before she learned to shut the doors tight, and that was a grief she did not dwell on, because dwelling on dead birds did not bring them back, and the living ones still needed fed. But the work had its own deep rhythm now, and she rose each day glad to meet it. She had not been glad to get out of bed in 3 years.
She kept records, the way Emmett's journal had taught her. Which bed the birds had worked, for how long, when she planted behind them, how each row came. She filled the back of an old ledger with her cramped figures and her sketches of the coops, refining the design as she went. The 4th coop had a better roof. The 5th had a clever sliding panel that let her move the birds to fresh ground without lifting them out. Each one built faster than the last, until the line of coops moving down her beds looked like a strange migration of wooden animals, patient and purposeful and oddly beautiful in the evening light.
And the smell. That was what she noticed most. The smell of the earth had changed. Where it had been dry and dead and mineral, now it smelled sweet and loamy and alive. She breathed it in every morning standing at the fence. Then Vernon began to talk, not loudly at first, not in any way that could be pointed to or argued with. That was not Vernon's method. Vernon Garth did not attack. He insinuated, he mentioned, he let things fall from his mouth the way a man drops crumbs, casually, as though he had not noticed them falling, and the crumbs were picked up by other mouths and carried further and dropped again until the whole township was fed on something nobody could quite trace back to its source. He mentioned to men leaning on his store counter that he was not sure the Wynn place was being kept clean. All those birds, all those droppings worked right into the dirt where she meant to grow food a body would eat. He said he did not like to speak ill of a widow, but a man had a duty to his neighbors, and he had heard. Here he would drop his voice. He had heard that sickness came from filth like that. The talk spread the way Vernon's talk always spread, because he was Vernon Garth, and Vernon Garth knew best. He had been knowing best for 20 years in this township, and people had stopped questioning it the way they stopped questioning weather. Vernon said a thing, and the thing became true not because it was true, but because Vernon said it, and nobody had the courage or the standing to say otherwise. The church women grew careful around Eleanor now, their smiles tighter, their questions gentler, whether it was wise. All those chickens, so near where she grew her supper. Eleanor could see it in their faces, not concern, distance. They were stepping back from her, the way people step back from a thing they have been told is dangerous. The mercantile owner, Jessup, who had taken her extra eggs all summer, grew cool about it. He did not refuse them outright. That would have been a thing Eleanor could have fought. Instead, he hesitated. He said business was slow. He mentioned that a customer had asked whether the Wynn eggs were wholesome. He did not say which customer. He did not need to. The question itself was the weapon.
Eleanor felt the change like a draft under a door. The laughter had been bad. When the township drove past her rolling coops and shook their heads and called it a chicken parade, That had stung. But this was worse. Laughter you could turn your back on. Laughter had no teeth. But a whisper that your food might make people sick. That had teeth. That could bite. That could kill a farm faster than any drought. Because it did not matter how heavy her beans hung, if nobody in the county would buy them or eat them. She was being poisoned, not her garden, her reputation, and the poison was working. It was Silas who told her what she had not been able to see on her own. Because she had been too close to it, too deep inside the problem to see its shape from the outside. He came on a July evening, hot, the kind of Kansas heat that sits on you like a hand and will not let you up. The swallows were flying low over the garden, which meant rain tomorrow. Silas always watched the swallows. He sat on the porch step and took the water she offered and drank it slowly and looked out over her beds. The garden was magnificent now. Green so deep it looked black in places. The vines heavy. The bean rows thick as hedges. The potato hills bushed out so full you could not see the ground between them. And beyond the garden, across the road, across the fence, Vernon Garth's land spread flat and wide in the July heat, and Vernon's grass was yellow. His pasture was thin. His bottomland, which should have been the richest ground in the township, showed patches of bare dirt where crops should have been thick and tall. Eleanor had noticed it, but she had not understood it. Not until Silas pointed. "Look at his ground." She looked. "Now look at yours." She looked. "He's dying over there, Eleanor. That land's been worked to bone. Same thing yours was. Same thing every farm in this township will be in 10 years, because they're all doing the same thing the same way and buying the same seed from the same man and never putting back what they take out." He paused, fitting pieces together. "He needs your land, not because he's greedy. Well, he is greedy, but that's not why he needs it. He needs it because his own ground is finished, and he knows it. He's been buying up tired farms for 15 years, working them hard, moving on to the next when the soil gives out. Like a man cutting down trees instead of planting them, and he's running out of trees." Eleanor sat with this, turning it. "Your place is the last piece he doesn't own on this side of the creek, and you're making it bloom, with chicken droppings and kitchen scraps, and not $1 spent at his store. Do you understand what that means to a man like Vernon Garth?" She understood. If Eleanor Wynne could make dead ground live again without Vernon's seed and Vernon's feed and Vernon's advice, then Vernon Garth's word was worth nothing. His store was worth nothing. His 20 years of knowing best were worth nothing. Because a woman alone with 176 chickens and no money had done what Vernon, with all his money and all his land and all his authority, had never managed. She was not just succeeding. She was making him irrelevant. "There's more," Silas said, and his voice was different now, quieter.
the way it got when he was about to say something he had carried a long time.
Emmett wasn't the only one. You know Caleb Bridwell, young fellow, lives out past the mill.
I know him. His father farmed the piece Vernon owns now, east of the creek. Good ground once, good as any in the county. 3 years of poor seed, 3 years of crops coming up thin and weak, and then Vernon showed up with an offer and a note and a smile, and the Bridwell place was gone. Caleb was 15. He let it sit. I kept quiet, had no proof. A deaf old man's suspicion doesn't carry weight in a township run by the man you're suspicious of. But I watched, and I counted, and the Bridwell place was not the first, and it was not the last. Eleanor thought of Emmett's journal. 3 years of falling germination. Not the soil's fault. She thought of the note in her drawer. $20 become 87. How many? Silas was quiet for a long time.
4 farms that I know of. Could be more. Probably is more.
4 farms. 4 families. Ground worked to death and bought for nothing, and worked to death again. And the man who did it sitting on the County Agricultural Society, passing judgment on other men's crops, while his own fields died under his feet. Eleanor looked at her garden, at the impossible green of it, at the birds in their coops, at the soil so alive it looked like it belonged to a different farm altogether. And she thought, this garden is not just a garden. It is evidence. It is proof that the ground was never broken. It was robbed. The next blow came at church, a Sunday in late July, the heat unbearable, the hymns flat, the sermon long, and afterward in the churchyard, where the women gathered in their good dresses and the men stood in groups and talked of weather and crops and prices. Eleanor stood alone, which was not new. But today, the alone felt different. The alone felt pointed, like the space around her had been measured. And then Phoebe Colby crossed it. Phoebe was 45, tall, thin in a way that spoke of years of doing without and making it look like a choice. Her husband, Alden, had farmed south of town, past tense. Vernon Garth held that land now, had held it for 7 years. Alden Colby worked for wages at the lumber mill and did not speak of how he had lost his farm, and Phoebe did not speak of it either. And the silence between them on the subject was so large you could have fit a house in it. Phoebe walked up to Eleanor in the churchyard and stood beside her and did not look at her. She looked straight ahead at the church wall, as though she were reading something written there that no one else could see. He's going to try to keep you out of the fair. Eleanor did not turn her head either. 2 women standing side by side, looking at a wall. To anyone watching, it was nothing.
The Agricultural Society meets Tuesday. Vernon's going to raise a motion. Health concerns, public safety. All those birds so close to food crops. He wants an official ruling that your produce is unfit for exhibition. How do you know this? Because he did the same thing to Alden. Not the fair. The contract with the Army Depot. Alden had a supply contract for grain. Vernon told the depot commander the grain was grown on contaminated ground. No proof. Didn't need proof. The word was enough. The contract went to Vernon's man instead. 6 months later, Alden couldn't make his note, and Vernon took the farm. Eleanor felt the ground tilt under her. "Why are you telling me this?" Phoebe was quiet. Then, "Because nobody told me." She walked away, back to the group, back to the silence, and Eleanor stood in the churchyard holding a truth she could not put down. The fair. The Shawnee County Fair was where reputations were made. A blue ribbon at the fair was worth more than the prize money. It was the township's verdict, spoken in public, on whose ground was good and whose was not. If Eleanor could stand at that table in the fall with the heaviest, finest produce in the county, the whispering would die. Because folks believed their own eyes over any man's gossip. Vernon knew it too. That was exactly why he meant to keep her out. And if he got the Agricultural Society to declare her produce unfit, not just for the fair, but officially, on the record, then it was not just a ribbon she would lose. It was her market, her reputation. The whisper made permanent, and she would never get out from under it. She had 2 days before the Tuesday meeting. Eleanor spent them working and thinking. The coops rolled forward, the birds scratched, the garden grew, and in her mind a plan took shape. Not a clever plan, not a safe plan, a desperate plan, which was the only kind she had left. She went to the meeting. The society met in the back room of the town hall, a hot, low-ceilinged room that smelled of dust and tobacco and the sweat of men who had ridden in from their farms to sit in chairs too small for them. Vernon sat among them, broad and easy, certain of his ground. He looked at Eleanor the way a cat looks at a bird that has flown into the house. Eleanor stood with Emmett's old ledger held against her chest, her heart going so hard she could feel it in her teeth. And she made them an offer, not a plea, not a request, a challenge. She said she had heard her produce called unfit, and she would not have it said behind her back when it could be tested to her face. Let them come to her farm, all of them, anyone who cared to, and inspect it top to bottom before the fair. Let them see the birds, the coops, the beds, the records she had kept. Let them dig her potatoes themselves and weigh them against any plot in the county. And let them enter her produce at the fair on its merits, like anyone else's, judged blind if they liked, not knowing whose it was. So no man could say she had won on anything but the food itself. The room was quiet. It was a fair offer, and fair offers are hard to refuse in front of witnesses. To say no was to admit they only meant to keep her out. Vernon saw the trap closing. He had come expecting a vote he had already won, expecting Eleanor to be absent or if present to be pleading, and instead she was standing in front of them with her shoulders square, making an offer so reasonable that refusing it would make every man in the room look like exactly what he was.
He tried to talk his way clear. He spoke of public health, of duty, of the dangers a man of experience could foresee that a well-meaning widow could not. He was smooth. He was practiced. He had won 100 arguments in this room, and he might have won again, because smooth wins more often than right in a room full of men who owe you money. Except that Silas Drummond had come to the meeting too, sitting in the back, where folks always seated him to forget him. Silas stood, and because he was half deaf, he spoke too loud, and the loudness filled the room the way thunder fills a valley, and it stopped Vernon Garth cold. I farmed this county 60 years, buried 2 wives and most of my friends doing it, and I'm telling you, what that woman has done out there is the soundest farming I have ever seen. His voice was huge, not angry, just big. The way truth is big when it has been kept small for too long and finally finds a room large enough to stand up in. Older than seed catalogs, older than this county. Folks have known forever that beasts feed the ground that feeds them. She just had the wit to do it where everybody could watch. There's nothing dirty in it. There's nothing dangerous in it. He looked at Vernon, straight at him.
The only thing dangerous to anybody in this room is that she did it cheaper and better than the man who sells you your seed. Nobody had heard Silas Drummond make a speech in 20 years. The novelty alone held them. The sense of it held them longer. And behind the words was something every man in that room recognized. Authority. Not the kind that comes from money or position. The kind that comes from 60 years of putting your hands in the dirt and learning what the dirt has to teach. The society voted, with Vernon's own customers watching one another's faces. They accepted Eleanor's offer, in full. The inspection would happen. The judging would be blind. Her entries would stand or fall on the food itself. Vernon sat through the vote with his face set like stone, and when it was done, he rose and put on his hat and walked out without a word. Which was wrong. Vernon always had a word. Vernon always had the last word. And the silence he left behind him was louder than anything Silas had said. Eleanor walked out into the autumn dusk with her ledger under her arm, and her knees shaking so badly she had to stop on the steps and hold the railing. Silas came out behind her, stood beside her, said nothing, because nothing needed saying. The inspection was set for the following Saturday. Eleanor worked those days the way she imagined soldiers work before a battle. Not with panic, with precision. She cleaned every coop until the wood showed pale, raked every path, weeded every row. She dug sample potatoes from 6 different hills and weighed them on the kitchen scale and wrote the numbers in her ledger. Every number higher than the last. Every number proof. She was ready, and she was terrified. Because ready and terrified are not opposites. They are neighbors. They share a wall. And sometimes at night, you can hear one through the other.
Thursday night, 2 days before the inspection. The wind came up out of the southwest, hot and dry. The kind of wind that makes the dogs nervous and the horses stamp and the chickens press together in their coops and go quiet. Which is wrong. Chickens are never quiet. Quiet chickens are frightened chickens. Eleanor went to bed late, checked the coops, checked the latches, checked the water. Everything tight, everything still. The wind pushed at the house, and she lay in the dark thinking about Saturday and about Vernon's face when the vote went against him and about the silence he had left when he walked out. That wrong silence. She fell asleep thinking about it and woke to screaming. Not human screaming. Worse. The high, blind panic clamor of 100 birds at once. A sound that went through the walls and through her chest and through 3 years of living alone on a farm where every sound at night meant something bad. She was out the door before she was fully awake, running across the yard in her nightclothes with a lantern in one hand and her feet bare on the cold ground. The wind hit her and nearly took the lantern, and she held it up and saw the large coop, the one at the far end, nearest her finest potato hills, overturned, broken open, the wire torn loose from the frame, birds everywhere, scattering into the dark, shrieking, some running, some flying in that useless flapping way chickens fly when they are too terrified to remember they cannot. She ran to the coop, set the lantern down, and saw the rest. The latches she had checked 2 hours ago, thrown open, not broken, not chewed, thrown by a hand, a human hand, and the potato hills, her finest, heaviest, most perfect hills, trampled flat, every plant torn and stamped into the dirt, the soil churned and ruined, and in the soft ground, boot prints, deep and wide, pressed clear, not paw prints, boots, a man's boots, heavy and deliberate, walking up and down her rows, stamping, grinding, destroying with a patience that was worse than rage, because rage is fast, and this had been slow. This had been thorough. This had been a man who took his time because he believed he would never be questioned. Eleanor did not cry. She sat down right there in the cold, ruined dirt, with the lantern beside her guttering in the wind, and the birds calling in the dark, and the smell of crushed green things rising around her. And she felt something worse than crying, a hollow where certainty used to be, the certainty that fighting was worth the cost, that standing up had a point. The ground had been silenced. 2 days before anyone was coming to listen. She thought about quitting. The thought came clear and reasonable. She could meet the inspectors at the gate Saturday morning and tell them she had withdrawn. She could sell her birds, pay her account, keep her head down, be the cautionary tale instead of the fool who fought and lost in public. It would be easier, and nobody would blame her. Nobody blames the widow who gives up. They say she was brave to try, and then they forget her. The lantern guttered again, almost went out, and somewhere in the dark, far off near the creek, a hen called. One small, scared voice in the enormous night, and another answered. Closer. Two of them. At least. Still out there, still alive, still calling to each other. Eleanor listened to them. Two birds in the dark, finding each other by sound. Not because they were brave. Chickens are not brave. Because they were alive, and alive things call out, and alive things answer. It is what living does. It calls, and it does not stop calling because the dark is large and the wind is cold and someone has come in the night and broken the place where you were safe. She got to her feet, stiff, cold, her nightgown wet with dew and her feet muddy and her hands shaking. But up, on her feet, and the answer was there, had been there the whole time, in the calling of those birds. She had been too gutted to hear it. She did not need the showpiece hills. She did not need to win on the few perfect potatoes some coward had trampled. She had told the society to dig her ground themselves and weigh it against any plot in the county. And the whole garden was like that, every bed. The birds had worked all of it. He could trample one corner, but he could not trample an acre. The proof was not in the part he had wrecked. The proof was in the part he could not reach. She left the trampled beds exactly as she found them. The crushed plants, the boot prints, the broken coop. She did not clean it up. She did not smooth the soil. She left it there, open, visible. Because a man who breaks your things in the dark does not want those things seen in the light. He wants them gone, cleaned up. So the story is simply, her garden failed, the way everyone said it would. But if you leave the wreckage where it falls, if you stand beside it in the morning and let people see it with their own eyes, then the story changes. Then the story is not about a garden that failed. The story is about a garden that was attacked. And that is a very different story. She woke Silas before dawn, and the two of them spent Friday gathering birds and mending wire and saying nothing about the hills at the end. They recovered all but 4 of the scattered flock, set the broken coop to rights, cleaned and straightened everything, except the trampled beds. Those she left. Silas looked at the boot prints, then at Eleanor, then at the boot prints again.
You're leaving them.
I'm leaving them. He nodded, slowly, the way he nodded when something fit.
Saturday's gonna be something. Yes, it is. Friday passed, the longest day of Eleanor's life, longer than the day Emmett died, because that day she had known how it would end, and this day she did not. She checked the remaining coops, counted the birds, walked the good beds, touched the plants, felt the potatoes firm and heavy under the soil, felt the beans thick on their stems. The garden was ready. The proof was in the ground. She went to bed Friday night and did not sleep. She lay in the dark and held the moment the way you hold a breath before a dive, knowing that when you let go, everything changes, and there is no going back. Saturday came clear and bright, the kind of Kansas morning that looks like it was painted by someone who wanted you to believe the world is fair. Blue sky hammered flat from edge to edge. Not a cloud, not a shadow. The light so clean it hurt. They arrived in a procession. 6 members of the Agricultural Society in 2 buggies. The mercantile owner Jessup in his wagon, looking like a man who would rather be anywhere else. Phoebe Colby, walking because she lived close enough, and because walking gave her a reason to arrive last and stand at the edge where she could see everything without being seen. A county officer named Howell, a careful man, the kind who carries a pencil behind his ear and believes that what gets written down becomes real. And Vernon Garth, at the front, riding tall, riding easy, his buggy freshly washed, his coat brushed, looking for all the world like a man come to watch a thing he had already decided the outcome of. A good many folks from the township trailed behind, curious, drawn by the smell of a reckoning. Eleanor met them at the gate. She had dressed plainly, her work dress, the one with the dirt that would not wash out of the knees. Her hair pinned back, her hands clean but rough. She held Emmett's old ledger against her chest, and a clean spade stood beside her, leaning against the fence post. She looked calm. She was not calm. Her heart was beating so hard she was afraid they could see it through her dress. But calm is not something you feel. Calm is something you do. Gentlemen, you came to inspect, and you're welcome to all of it. The birds are in their coops. The records are in this ledger for any who want them, and the ground is the ground. She paused. Let it land. Dig wherever you like. She had thought hard about that. She did not lead them to her best beds. She told them to choose, because a man cannot claim the test was rigged if he is the one who picks the spot.
They were awkward about it at first. 6 men in their good coats standing in a widow's garden, unsure how to begin. There is something deeply uncomfortable about digging up a woman's potatoes while she watches. And then Phoebe Colby walked up from the back of the crowd, took the spade from the fence post without asking, drove it into the nearest hill with a sound like a door opening, and turned up a nest of potatoes so big and so many that a sound went through the crowd. A low sound, deeper than a gasp. The sound of people surprised against their will. After that, they dug in earnest. And everywhere they dug, it was the same. Hill after hill, bed after bed. The spade turned up heavy, clean potatoes by the dozen, smooth-skinned, dense, the size of a man's fist, some bigger, 10 to a hill, 12, 14. Numbers the men had never pulled from their own ground. The beans hung thick on stems as big as a finger, clusters so heavy the stalks leaned. The squash lay broad and green, and a man needed both arms to lift one, and the lifting made him grunt, and the grunt made the crowd laugh. Surprised laughter. The kind that breaks out of you when the world does something you did not give it permission to do. Officer Howell wrote down weights. He had brought a hanging scale, brass and iron, and the numbers climbed, past anything the men had seen on their own places, past anything they had seen at any fair in any year. Past the kind of numbers that make a man stop trusting his own scale and shake it and try again. The same numbers. Every time. The crowd warmed. The murmur changed. The faces changed. The neighbors who had kept their distance were looking at those potatoes, those beans, that squash. And they were recalculating, quietly, without admitting the first calculation was wrong. Eleanor stood apart and watched and said nothing. The ground was doing the talking, the way she had always known it would. The ground had a voice, and it was louder than Vernon. And it was louder than gossip. Vernon had been watching from the fence, arms folded, face set, saying nothing, which was wrong. Vernon Garth always had something to say. The silence meant he was calculating, looking for the angle that would turn this back in his direction. And he found it, or thought he did. Because Vernon looked down to the far end of the garden, where the trampled beds lay ugly and obvious in the morning light, and Vernon could not keep from using it. The way a man who is losing cannot keep from reaching for the one card he thinks will save him, even when the card is the thing that will bury him. And what's that then? His voice, too loud, trying to sound casual and failing. Down there, end of the garden, looks to me like the widow's miracle has got a rough patch. Looks like half of it's gone and failed. He stepped away from the fence, pointed. You see how the plants are torn up? Flatten the dirt, all that good soil she's been telling you about, and the crops lying dead in it. Wonder why she walked us past that part. Wonder what happened down there that she doesn't want us to see. He was performing now, playing to the crowd. His voice had that store counter quality, that knowing best quality, that had carried him for 2 decades. And for a moment, the crowd tilted. Because Vernon Garth was Vernon Garth, and old habits die hard, harder than old soil. Eleanor felt the tilt, felt the crowd begin to pull away from her again, and she knew, with a certainty as cold and clear as the morning itself, that this was it, the moment, the hinge, the second where everything turned one way or the other. She walked toward Vernon. The crowd parted for her without being asked. She stopped 10 feet from him, and she asked him a question. One question, in a voice so quiet that every person in the yard leaned forward to hear it. "Mr. Garth, how do you know what it looks like down there?" Vernon blinked. "You've been standing at the fence since you arrived. You haven't walked past the third bed. Nobody has led you down there. Nobody has shown you. And yet you just described, in detail, torn up plants, crop lying flat in the dirt, good soil wasted." She let the silence work. "How do you know what it looks like at the end of my garden when you haven't been to the end of my garden?"
The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eleanor had ever heard, louder than the birds screaming Thursday night, louder than the wind, louder than 3 years of gossip and whispers and knowing best. It was the silence of 30 people understanding something at the same time, understanding it in their chests before their minds caught up. Vernon's face changed, not all at once, in stages, the confident expression going stiff, the certainty in his eyes flickering, then something behind his face falling, quietly, completely. He opened his mouth, and what came out was not an answer. Well, it's plain enough from where I stood. Anyone can see." "No, Mr. Garth. You cannot see the end of these beds from the fence. The corn is too tall. The coop is in the way. I know because I checked this morning. I stood at the fence myself to be sure." She turned to the crowd. "The plants down there were trampled Thursday night. The latches on my coop were thrown open by hand, not chewed, not broken, thrown. And there are boot prints in the soil, a man's boots, large. I would like Officer Howell to come and look at them."
Howell came. He walked to the end of the garden. The crowd followed, all of them, Vernon too, because staying behind would have been worse than going. Eleanor knelt at the edge of the trampled beds. The boot prints were still there, clear and deep in the soft ground. She placed her own foot beside the nearest one, her small bare track next to a deep, wide heel print. The difference was obvious. "Those are not my prints."
Howell crouched, examined the prints, took his pencil from behind his ear, and measured the length against his hand, and wrote the number down. Then he stood. And he did a thing that was not in any rule book. He looked at the boots of the men standing around the bed, a slow, deliberate look, starting at one end of the half circle and traveling along it. boot by boot, face by face. Every man's boots were clean, dusty from the road, dry, normal, until the look reached Vernon Garth. Vernon's boots were caked, not with road dust, not with the pale, dry dirt of his own dying fields, with soil so dark it was almost black, the kind that existed in only one place in the entire township, the soil that Eleanor's birds had made, that no other farm in the county had, because no other farm in the county had done what Eleanor had done. The soil was packed in his heels, ground into the welts, smeared across the sole, the same soil that was churned up around the trampled hills, the same color, the same texture. Vernon looked down, following Howell's gaze to his own feet, and the color left his face. All of it, all at once. He had not been clever. A man so certain of his standing had not thought to clean his boots, because a man like Vernon Garth had never had to cover his tracks. He had never believed anyone was looking at them. Nobody spoke. The crowd saw it. Howell saw it. The society men saw it, and they understood. In one slow turning moment, exactly who had crept onto a widow's farm in the dark, and why. And then a voice came from the back of the crowd. He did it to my father, too. Caleb Bridwell, 28 years old, thin, sunburned, standing at the edge the way young men stand when they have been pushed there by someone bigger. He stepped forward. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. 3 years of bad seed. 3 years of crops coming up thin and dying early. My father bought every season from Garth's store. Same seed, same price, and every year worse than the last. Until the farm couldn't make the note, and Vernon Garth took the land. He looked at Vernon, and there was something in that look that went past anger into a place where a boy of 15 watches his father sign away the only thing he has and carries that moment inside him for 13 years, waiting for a place to set it down. I was 15. My father died 2 years later, and I always knew the seed was wrong. I just couldn't prove it. Phoebe Colby spoke next. She did not step forward. She did not need to. Her voice came from where she stood, clear and flat, and carrying the weight of 7 years of silence. Alden's supply contract with the Army Depot. Vernon told the commander our grain was grown on contaminated ground. No proof, no inspection. Just a word from a man whose word was law in this township. The contract went to Vernon's man instead. 6 months later, we couldn't make the note. Vernon took the farm. Alden hasn't spoken of it since. I'm speaking of it now. Eleanor reached into the ledger she had been carrying all morning, and she pulled out the journal. Emmett's journal. She opened it to the records, held it up so Howell could see. My husband kept these numbers for 3 years. Seed purchased from Garth's store. Year 1. 70% germination. Year 2, 51%. Year 3, 34%. Same soil, same beds, same care. The seed got worse, the crops failed, and my husband died believing it was his fault. She closed the journal, held it against her chest. It was not his fault.
3 words, but the weight of them, the weight of a dead man vindicated in a garden he never got to see. The weight of a name cleared in front of the town that had pitied him and dismissed him. That weight settled on the crowd like snow, silent, heavy, changing everything it touched. Howell wrote it all down. Every word, every name, every number. The pencil moving steadily across the page. A careful man doing careful work. Making it something that could not be unsaid or unseen or whispered away. Vernon Garth stood in the middle of it all, and for the first time in anyone's memory, he had nothing to say. His mouth opened and closed, and the crowd drew back from him. Not angrily, not with shouting. Worse. They drew back the way you step away from a chair that turns out to be rotten, with a kind of sad, astonished recognition. We sat in that chair for 20 years, and it was never solid. Vernon turned, walked to his horse, through the crowd that opened for him without a word. And the wordlessness was the worst thing, because Vernon Garth had built his whole life on words, on talk, on the assumption that his voice was the loudest and therefore the truest in any room. And now the room had gone silent around him. He mounted, he rode away, and the township let him go. Eleanor watched him go, and she felt not triumph, not satisfaction. She felt tired, the deep tiredness of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down and cannot tell yet whether her arms are relieved or just empty. Silas stood beside her. He had not spoken since the meeting at the town hall. His speech was used up. His one great loud speech that had filled a room and changed a vote. He had spent it, and now he stood quiet again. But a different quiet. The kind that comes from having been heard. Finally. After 60 years, he put his hand on Eleanor's shoulder, just for a moment, the weight of it rough and warm. And then he took it away and walked down the lane toward the creek. And Eleanor let him go. Because some things do not need to be said. They only need to be felt. The fair was the following week. They judged the produce blind, as Eleanor had asked, the entries numbered and the names sealed in envelopes, and the judging table set up in the big tent the way it was set up every year, with the same white cloth and the same brass scales and the same row of ribbons pinned to a board. The judge was a man from the next county over, brought in special, because after what had happened, nobody trusted a local man to do it.
He was a small, quiet man with spectacles and dirt under his nails. He picked up each entry, turned it, weighed it, pressed it with his thumb, set it down, made a note, moved to the next. He reached the potatoes, lifted the first basket. An ordinary entry. Good. Solid. He weighed them, nodded, set them down. He lifted the second basket, and he stopped. His hands went still. He held one up, turned it in the light, held up another. He set the basket on the scale, and the number made him take off his spectacles and clean them and put them back on and look again. He moved to the beans, the same pause, the same cleaning of the spectacles, the same look of a man who has been judging produce for 30 years and is seeing something he has not seen before. The squash, broad and heavy and so deeply colored, the green was almost black. He needed both hands to lift one, and when he set it on the scale, the needle swung so far, he actually laughed. A short, surprised bark that he immediately tried to suppress because judges are not supposed to laugh. But the laugh was out, and the crowd heard it, and the crowd began to murmur. Howell opened the envelopes, read the codes, matched them to the entry cards. Eleanor Wynne, potatoes, first place. Eleanor Wynne, string beans, first place. Eleanor Wynne, summer squash, first place. And then a cheer went through the tent. The kind of cheer that comes up from a crowd when something true happens in front of them. Something they can see with their own eyes and do not have to take on anyone's word. Their own eyes. Their own hands that had dug those potatoes. Their own arms that had lifted that squash. Their own surprise that had become their own belief, that had become this sound. This noise that filled the tent and went out through the canvas and carried across the fairground. 3 ribbons, blue, pinned to the plain work dress of a widow who had stood at her fence in the spring with nothing but dead ground and a saying she had not yet learned to read. 3 ribbons that meant the township had looked at her and seen not a foolish woman with a chicken parade, but a farmer, the best farmer in the county. Eleanor stood at the table and held the ribbons and smiled. The real smile, the one from below the ribs, and somewhere in the back of the tent, standing alone. Phoebe Colby smiled too, a small private smile that nobody saw. But it was there. The weeks that followed were a slow, quiet revolution, the kind that does not announce itself, that simply changes, one thing at a time, one person at a time. The local farmers who had bought seed from Vernon's store for 20 years began, one by one, to send their orders elsewhere, to a supplier 2 counties over, to a catalog house in St. Louis.
not because anyone organized it, but because they had seen Eleanor's ground, had dug her potatoes with their own hands, and had looked at their own fields afterward, asking for the first time a question they had not thought to ask. Why does my ground look like this? And whose seed have I been planting? Jessup at the mercantile came to Eleanor's gate on a Wednesday, hat in his hands, face red. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Wynne, for the eggs. For listening to talk I should have known better than to listen to. Eleanor looked at him, and she decided not to be angry, because anger is expensive, and she had spent enough. Bring me 24 egg crates on Friday, Mr. Jessup. I'll have them full for you by Monday. He nodded, relieved, and walked away quickly before she could change her mind. Caleb Bridwell came on a Saturday, rode up the lane on a borrowed horse with a borrowed ledger under his arm and a look on his face that Eleanor recognized. The look she had worn standing in the hatchery doorway in April. The look of a person standing on the edge of something. I want to learn how you did it. Did what? All of it. The coops, the beds, the rotation, the records. I've got 40 acres out past the mill. Vernon doesn't own it. He doesn't hold a note on it. It's mine free and clear, and it's dying the same way yours was. Eleanor looked at him, 28 years old, thin, sunburned, his father's eyes, his father's land. Can you build a coop? I can learn. Can you get chickens? I know where the hatchery is. She almost smiled. Come back Monday. Bring your hammer. The matter of the promissory note resolved itself the way such things resolve when a township learns to look at fine print with suspicion. Howell brought the note to the county clerk, and the clerk compared the handwriting of the amount to the handwriting of the signature, and asked a question no one had ever asked about a document bearing Vernon Garth's name. Is this amount correct? And the question was enough. Because once it is asked about one note, every note comes into question. And the men who owed on those notes began, one by one, to ask the same question. Vernon did not go to jail. He simply lost. Not his money, not his store. He lost trust, which is the only currency a man like that actually trades in. The seed and the feed and the notes were just machinery. Trust was the fuel. And without it, the machinery went nowhere. His store stayed open, but the counter was emptier. He was still Vernon Garth, but the name had lost its weight. That was his punishment. Irrelevance. Which for a man who had built his life on being essential was worse than any sell. The following spring, Eleanor stood at her fence in the early light and watched a line of rolling coops move slowly down beds so dark they looked black against the morning. The birds clucked and scratched and dusted, turning weeds and bugs and scraps into next year's harvest, just as they had the year before. The rhythm of it steady and patient, the way good things are, not dramatic, not loud, just continuing, day after day, coop by coop, bed by bed. But this spring she was not alone at the fence. Phoebe Colby stood beside her, arms folded, watching the coops with the sharp evaluating eye of a woman who is already building one in her mind. Behind her stood two neighbor women, come to see how the coops were made, how the rotation worked. They had notebooks. They had questions. They had the look of people at the beginning of something. And Caleb Bridwell was in the garden itself, on his knees in the soil with a tape measure and a pencil and a borrowed ledger, and a concentration so fierce it made Eleanor's heart ache, because she had seen that concentration before. In Emmett, in the journal, in the careful, cramped handwriting of a man who believed that if you wrote the numbers down and paid attention to what the ground was telling you, then the ground would teach you everything you needed to know. Down the lane Silas came walking, slow, his hat pushed back, his limp bad today, waving his hat the way he always did. Late, as always, glad as ever. Eleanor watched him come and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not hope. She had felt hope. Hope was spring. This was something past hope. This was the place you get to when the hoping is done and the thing you hoped for is simply here. Real, solid, growing. The garden stretched behind her, alive in a way that would have made Emmett stop and stare and laugh the way she had laughed, alone in the dirt, holding potatoes in both hands. Silas reached the fence, leaned on it, breathing hard from the walk, his eyes going over the garden the way they always did, reading it, with patience, with attention, with 60 years of knowledge worn smooth as a river stone. Looking good. It is. Emmett would have liked to see it. Yes, he would. They stood together, an old man and a woman who was not old, but was no longer young. Two people who had learned to read the ground. And the ground spread before them, full of the patient ongoing work of birds and soil and seasons, and the stubborn persistence of a woman who had refused to quit when quitting was the sensible thing to do. Nothing's worthless, her grandmother had said. There's only folks who haven't learned to read it yet. Eleanor had learned to read the ground, the people, and herself, and what she read, standing at her fence in the early spring light, with the birds scratching and the soil dark and the whole green impossible future of it spreading out before her. What she read was this, that the things the world calls broken, the tired soil, the failing farm, the widow alone, the deaf old man, the chickens nobody wanted. These things are not broken. They are unread. They are letters in a language nobody has bothered to learn. And when you learn it, when you kneel in the dirt and put your hands in it and listen, really listen, the way Silas listens,
The way the swallows listen to the rain before it comes. Then the language opens up, and what it says, what it has always been saying. To anyone patient enough and stubborn enough and desperate enough to hear it.
Is grow.